That engine had defeated 6 certified technicians over 4 days. It had brought the head of engineering at Whitmore Motors, a man with a master's degree from MIT and 17 years of professional credentials behind his name, to sign a failure report with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. It had nearly swallowed a $5 million contract hold. The kind of contract that took Audrey Whitmore 3 years to build and 1 weekend to almost lose. And then, at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, a man in a faded gray t-shirt walked into the service bay. His hands still carried the faint trace of engine oil from the afternoon shift he'd finished 4 hours earlier. His 6-year-old son was asleep in the truck parked outside a small red toy toolbox tucked under one arm. The man walked to the car without greeting anyone, without asking any questions. He stood in front of the engine for a long moment, very still, and then he said quietly and without any drama at all, "I know where the problem is."
I know where the problem is.
What happens when this man everyone dismissed is the only one who can save everything? The garage was called Booker Auto, and it sat on the eastern edge of town where the streets got quieter, and the buildings got shorter, and nobody wore a tie. It was a 2-bay operation in a building that had been a furniture repair shop in a previous life, and it still had the old smell of sawdust underneath the newer smell of motor oil and brake fluid. The sign out front was hand-painted. The lift was second-hand, but every tool on the wall hung in its exact place, sorted by function and by size, and the floor was swept clean at the end of every working day without exception. Elijah Booker ran the shop the way he ran everything, without announcement, without decoration, and with a precision that most people who came in for an oil change never noticed and never needed to. Elijah was 36 years old and looked at it in the honest way that comes from working with your hands in all weather. He was tall and lean, with rich, dark brown skin, close-cropped hair just beginning to show the first faint touches of gray at the temples, and a face that didn't offer much away unless you knew how to look. His mother, before she passed, used to say he had the kind of face that made strangers want to ask him for directions. He didn't talk much to customers beyond what the job required. He didn't explain himself. He didn't volunteer his history. When people asked how long he'd been doing this, he said a few years, which was technically true, if you counted only the years at Booker Auto and ignored everything that came before. In the bottom drawer of the wooden desk in the corner, the desk that held the shop's invoice book, and a battery-operated radio and not much else, there was a folded document in a manila envelope. It was a certificate of appointment from Bauer Motorsport, a German mechanical engineering firm that consulted for European supercar manufacturers, naming Elijah Booker as chief engine architect at the age of 31, the youngest in the company's history. The envelope had not been opened in 2 years. On top of the desk, partly hidden behind the invoice book, there was a small framed photograph of a woman with a wide, knowing smile, her hair pulled back in a soft afro, holding a much younger Micah on her hip. Naomi. Elijah did not look at it often. He did not need to. In the corner of the shop, on a wooden stool with a cushion tied to the seat, sat Micah. He was 6 years old and serious in the way that small children sometimes are when they have been paying close attention to the world for their entire short lives. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's habit of going quiet when something was bothering him. His hair was carried in small, careful twists that Elijah had set the night before, the way he had been doing since Naomi died, the small patient motions taking longer than they used to as the boy's hair grew thicker. Every afternoon after school, he came to the shop, sat on the stool, and opened his red toy toolbox, a battered plastic thing with a yellow latch that he had owned since he was 3. He would lay out the toy wrench and the toy screwdriver and the toy ratchet on the floor in front of him, and then he would crouch over whatever piece of scrap metal Elijah had set aside for him and pretend to work. He took it seriously. He always had. On the shelf above Elijah's desk beside the radio and the invoice book, there was a thick notebook with a brown leather cover. It was filled front to back in Elijah's handwriting notes on classic European engines, hand-drawn diagrams, annotated references, the accumulated record of 3 years of independent research. On the inside cover, in the same careful hand, was a single line for N. Beside it, smaller, almost invisible, and for whoever comes after. Across town on the main boulevard where the buildings had glass facades and the parking valets wore matching blazers, Whitmore Motors occupied a full city block. The banner stretched across the upper story of the building read, "Private Exhibition Special Classic Collection, Friday, 7 p.m." It was the most important event on Audrey Whitmore's calendar for the year, and it had been for the past 8 months. Audrey was 32 years old and ran Whitmore Motors with the kind of focused intensity that made her good at her job and occasionally difficult to be around. She had taken over the dealership from her father at 28, rebuilt the clientele in 3 years, and positioned Whitmore Motors as the premier destination for classic and collector vehicles on the Eastern Seaboard. She was precise, she was demanding, and she did not believe in second chances for people who wasted her time. She also had not slept properly in 4 days. Micah noticed the Whitmore Motors banner through the shop window one afternoon while Elijah was finishing a brake job on a sedan. The boy pressed his nose against the glass and studied the photograph of the cars. Then he looked back at his father. "Dad," he said, "do you think you could fix those?" Elijah glanced at the banner. He didn't answer. He turned back to the brake caliper and kept working. On Monday morning, Elijah drove to Whitmore Motors to pick up a parts order. He did this because the specific component he needed, a fuel delivery valve for a 1970s Italian Roadster he was restoring for a private client, was only available through a supplier that Whitmore Motors imported exclusively, and the wait time for a direct order was 6 weeks. Elijah had called ahead. He had a confirmation number. He brought Micah because school didn't start until 9 o'clock, and it was only a quick pickup. He wore what he always wore, work pants, steel-toed boots, a clean but well-worn jacket. Micah carried his red toolbox as he almost always did when they went anywhere together, the way other children carry stuffed animals. The showroom floor of Whitmore Motors was everything Booker Auto was not. High ceilings, recessed lighting cars displayed like sculpture on platforms of polished concrete. The staff moved in quiet clusters and spoke at the volume of a library. Elijah went to the parts counter, gave his confirmation number, and waited. Micah stood beside him and looked up at a silver 1962 Ferrari on the nearest platform with an expression of pure, uncomplicated awe. Derek Sullivan came through the door behind the counter before the parts clerk could respond to the confirmation number. He was the head of technical services at Whitmore Motors, 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of a man who had never in his professional life been told he was wrong by anyone whose opinion he respected. He looked at Elijah once from the top of his head to the toes of his boots with the efficient thoroughness of a man cataloging something he intends to discard. Then he looked at Micah and at the red plastic toolbox. He said loudly enough for the nearest cluster of staff and the 2 customers browsing the showroom floor to hear without difficulty, "This counter isn't a walk-in service desk for backyard mechanics. If you need parts, there's an auto supply warehouse on Route 9. He paused for exactly long enough to make the next part land. "And bring your kid to a place like this again and I'll have security escort you out. This isn't a playground." The showroom went quiet in the small, specific way that spaces go quiet when something has happened that everyone present has decided not to acknowledge. One of the browsing customers turned slightly away. A staff member near the far wall found something on her clipboard to look at. Micah stopped looking at the Ferrari. He looked down at the red toolbox in his hands instead, and then he pressed it against his chest. Here it is worth pausing for a moment the way one pauses in a doorway before stepping into another room. Because what happened at that counter was not in its surface form anything unusual. A man in expensive clothes spoke harshly to a man in work clothes. It happens in showrooms and restaurants and lobbies 1,000 times a day in this country, and most of the time the people watching it look away because looking away is easier than asking what they just saw. But some kinds of disrespect carry a longer history than the room they happen in. And the men who receive them have by a certain age developed a particular set of responses, none of which involve raising their voice, because raising a voice in a room like that has for men who look like Elijah Booker consequences disproportionate to the offense. So the silence is not weakness. The silence is a calculation made in a fraction of a second by a man who has run that calculation his entire adult life. And the dignity is real. and it is hard-won, and it costs something that the man in the expensive clothes will never have to pay. Elijah did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. He looked at Derek Sullivan for approximately 2 seconds. A look that was perfectly flat and perfectly still, and somehow more uncomfortable than anger would have been. And then he looked at Micah. He said nothing to Sullivan. He simply waited at the counter until the parts clerk, clearly wanting the interaction to end, processed the confirmation number and brought the component from the warehouse. Elijah signed for it, tucked the box under his arm, and walked to the door. Micah fell in beside him. Just before they reached the exit, Micah said quietly, "Dad, let's go." And they did. On the second floor behind the long window that overlooked the showroom floor, Audrey Whitmore had watched the exchange. She had seen Derek's performance, and she had seen the man in work clothes, and she had seen the small boy with the red plastic box pressed to his chest. She had not intervened. She had looked back at her phone. She had walked away. She told herself it was because she hadn't heard everything clearly. She would think about that later in the dark, in the quiet of the shop floor on Thursday night, and she would know that wasn't true. On Monday evening, Elijah drove home, collected Micah from the neighbor who had picked him up from school, and made dinner for the two of them: pasta, a green salad, a glass of water for himself, and apple juice for the boy. They ate at the small kitchen table with the window open to the backyard. Micah was quieter than usual. He ate his pasta in careful, measured forkfuls and didn't ask for a second serving. Afterward, they sat on the back step with the last of the daylight, Micah turning his toy screwdriver over in his hands. He had been thinking since the morning. Elijah could tell because the boy had his mother's thinking face, a slight downward pull at the corners of his mouth, a stillness in the eyes. Finally, Micah asked, "Dad, why did that man talk to you like that?" Elijah looked out over the yard where a maple tree was just beginning to turn at the edges. He let the question sit for a moment. "He didn't know who he was talking to," Elijah said. "Does that make it okay?" "No," Elijah said, "it doesn't." Micah turned the screwdriver over again. "Why didn't you say anything back?" Elijah reached over and put a hand on the boy's shoulder briefly. The way he touched things he cared about without performance, without excess. Some things don't need to be said. They only need to be done. Micah looked at him. He was 6, and there was a limit to what 6 years of living could do with a statement like that. But he nodded, because he trusted his father in the wordless, complete way that children trust the people who have never once given them a reason not to. Inside, after Micah was asleep, Elijah stood at the kitchen shelf and looked at the brown leather notebook. He had not opened it in several months. It held, among other things, 47 pages of research on Maurizio Rinaldi's engineering methodology. The culmination of 3 years of independent study that Elijah had pursued alongside his work at Bauer Motorsport during the years when he had still believed he would one day write something definitive and useful about the way certain engineers understood machines, not as mechanical systems, but as acoustic ones. Rinaldi had been the greatest of these. He had designed engines the way composers write for string quartets, each component calibrated not just for function, but for resonance, for the specific frequency at which the whole assembly would operate as a single coherent system rather than a collection of individual parts. The research had begun as professional interest. It had become something close to obsession. And then Naomi had died on a Tuesday afternoon on a road she drove every day, and Elijah had closed the notebook and put it on the shelf and driven himself and a 3-year-old Micah back to this town where he had grown up and opened the shop and not looked back. Not because he was afraid of looking back, but because there was a boy who needed a father who was present. And Elijah Booker, above all things, knew how to be present. There is something here worth holding gently. The world will give your children many lessons about how they should be treated. Most of those lessons will be wrong or partial, or arrive at the worst possible time. The lessons that stay the ones that go on doing their quiet work for 40 years after the moment that delivered them are almost never spoken out loud. They are the ones a child absorbs from watching what their parent does when their parent had every right to break, and chose instead to remain. Tuesday brought no progress for Audrey. She brought in a restoration team from the city specialists with a strong reputation for pre-war European vehicles. They worked through the day. That evening, their team leader sat across from Audrey in the conference room and was honest in the way that only people who are genuinely stumped can afford to be. "Whatever Rinaldi did to that engine," he said, "he did it according to a logic that doesn't exist in any documentation I've ever encountered. The modifications are there, we can see them, but we don't understand the system they create. We're afraid to go further without that understanding because the wrong move could cause irreversible damage." He paused. "I think the person who can fix this engine is someone who has spent a great deal of time specifically studying how Rinaldi worked, not just classic car mechanics, Rinaldi himself." The Lamborghini Miura S had been built in 1971 and was one of fewer than 800 ever made. The specific example in Whitmore Motors' service bay had been modified in the 1990s by an Italian engineer named Maurizio Rinaldi, who had worked for a small Milanese firm that specialized in the mechanical restoration of pre-emissions-era European automobiles. Rinaldi had died in 2004, and he had left behind no written documentation of his modifications, no drawings, no service manuals, no annotated schematics. What he had left behind was a V12 engine that ran by all accounts better than the day it left the Sant'Agata factory until 4 days ago, when it had simply stopped. Not gradually, not with warning. It had stopped between one firing cycle and the next, as completely as if someone had switched it off at a source that no diagnostic instrument could locate. Edward Sinclair, who owned the car and 9 others in the collection he had placed on consignment with Whitmore Motors, had called Audrey personally. His voice had been calm. That was worse than shouting. If the Miura was not running and on display by Friday at 7 p.m., he said he would withdraw the consignment agreement in its entirety. $4.8 million in inventory gone. The exhibition, Whitmore Motors' most visible event in 3 years, reduced to a gap on a platform and a conversation that Audrey did not want to have. 6 of Whitmore Motors' certified technicians had worked on the Miura one after another and then in combinations over 4 days. None of them found the fault. The diagnostic system produced contradictory error codes that pointed in 3 different directions simultaneously and resolved none of them. Derek Sullivan, who had spent the better part of the 4th day under the hood, wrote in his technical report, "Engine unrecoverable. Recommend client notification of irreversible mechanical failure." Audrey read the report, set it face down on her desk, and called 3 independent specialists. The first declined when he heard the car's name and year too complex. He said, "Not enough documentation." The second quoted a timeline of 8 weeks and a fee that started at $500,000. The third drove in from 2 hours away, walked around the Miura for 15 minutes in the service bay, and then walked back to his car and drove home. He called Audrey from the road. "I don't know what Rinaldi did to that engine," he said. "And because I don't know, I can't fix it without risking making it worse. I'm sorry." Audrey stood alone in the service bay after the call ended. The Miura sat under the shop lights in its orange paint, which was the color of something expensive and unapologetic. She put one hand on the hood and looked at it for a long time. It was Monday evening. Friday was 4 days away. On Wednesday morning, Derek Sullivan proposed using a substitute vehicle, a Miura from 1969 that was close enough in appearance that most guests at the exhibition would not know the difference. Audrey rejected this in under 10 seconds. "That's not Edward's car," she said. "It's not what we agreed to display. We don't do that." Derek gave her a long look. She gave it back without blinking, and he left the room. Audrey was not a sentimental person, and she was not particularly given to principle for its own sake, but there were lines she did not cross in business. She had watched her father cross them, and she had watched what they cost him in the end, and she had decided early that her version of Whitmore Motors would not be built that way. On Thursday morning, Rebecca set a single sheet of paper on Audrey's desk and stood back without saying anything. The paper had 2 items on it. The first was a name, Elijah Booker Auto, followed by an address on the east side of town. Below the name, Rebecca had written in her precise, small handwriting what a contact in the industry had told her. Elijah Booker, former chief engine architect Bauer Motorsport, left the company 3 years ago, has not returned to the industry. He wrote the most comprehensive existing analysis of Rinaldi's engineering methodology. an unpublished thesis that is cited in 2 academic papers and 1 industry journal. Currently operates a one-man auto repair shop. Single father. Audrey read the page twice. She looked at Rebecca. This is the man from Monday. It was not a question. Rebecca said nothing. She didn't need to. Audrey looked out the window for a moment and then said, "Set up a meeting for tonight." She paused. "I'll go myself." Elijah was finishing the last job of the day, a routine coolant flush on a pickup truck, when he heard footsteps behind him that didn't belong in his shop. Heels on concrete have a specific sound, and that sound had no business being in Booker Auto at 8:30 on a Thursday evening. He rolled out from under the truck and stood up. Audrey Whitmore was standing in the doorway of the bay. Her jacket still on, her dark hair pulled back, a leather portfolio under one arm. Rebecca stood a step behind her. Elijah recognized Audrey immediately. She was the woman on the second floor, the one who had looked down at the showroom and then looked away. She recognized him too. He could see it in the slight adjustment in her posture. Not an apology, not yet, but an acknowledgement that she owed him something she wasn't entirely sure how to pay. Audrey did not waste time on preamble. "I have a 1971 Lamborghini Miura S with a modified V12 engine. Non-standard modifications, no documentation. 6 technicians, 2 outside teams, 4 days. Nobody can fix it. The exhibition is tomorrow at 7 p.m. I need you." Elijah wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at her. He did not rush to fill the silence. After a moment, Audrey said more quietly, "I know you came to our facility on Monday. I know what happened. I was there and I didn't stop it. That was wrong of me." She didn't elaborate. She wasn't a woman who expanded on apologies, but she had said it plainly and she meant it. And Elijah heard both things, the words and the fact of them. "What did your technicians do to it?" Elijah asked. She described the 4 days in detail, every attempt, every instrument used, every proposed solution. Elijah listened without interruption. When she was finished, he asked one question. "Who modified the engine last?" "An engineer named Rinaldi," Audrey said. "Maurizio Rinaldi. He died in 2004. For the first time since she had walked through the door, something changed in Elijah's face. Not a dramatic shift, a small thing, a stillness becoming a different kind of stillness. "You know him," Audrey said. It was not quite a question. "I know his work," Elijah said. "There's a difference." He glanced across the bay to where Micah was curled on the wooden stool under a blanket asleep, with the red plastic toolbox held loosely in one small hand. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked back at Audrey. "I'll come and look at it," he said. "I'm not making any promises." He locked the shop, drove Micah to Lorraine Davis's house 3 streets over. Lorraine was 64, a retired school teacher who had known Elijah since he was Micah's age, who had been at Naomi's funeral with a plate of cornbread and a quiet kind of presence that asks nothing of you. And she had watched Micah through 2 bouts of the flu and a broken collarbone and a phase where he would only eat beige foods, and she opened the door without a word, took one look at the bag of tools Elijah was carrying and nodded, and drove to Whitmore Motors. There is perhaps a softer truth living inside this moment, and it is worth saying simply. The kindest thing a person can sometimes do after they have wronged someone is not to pile that person with words, but to give them the room to be exactly who they already are in their own way, on their own terms. Audrey did not know in that moment that she was doing this. She thought she was hiring a mechanic. But people often do their best work without knowing what it is. The service bay was empty, except for the 3 of them in the car. The Miura sat under the overhead lights in its deep orange paint, and even standing still in a fluorescent-lit workshop, it had a quality that was difficult to name. Something about the proportions, the low and aggressive stance, the way the light moved across the long hood. Elijah stood in front of it for a long moment without touching it. Then he walked around it once slowly, his hands at his sides. Then again. Audrey watched from a stool she had pulled to the far end of the bay. She had folded her jacket over her lap, and she sat with the particular stillness of someone exercising restraint. Rebecca stood near the door. Derek Sullivan had been in the building when Elijah arrived. He had seen who Audrey had called in, and he had left without saying anything. His expression carried the specific quality of contempt that is shading over into something else and hasn't quite decided what. Elijah opened the hood. He looked at the engine without touching it. Just looked. The way he looked at everything before he touched it, which was the first habit he had developed when he was young and which he had never lost. Then he reached into his bag and took out a modified stethoscope. The chest piece replaced with a small metal probe, the tubing extended, the earpieces cushioned. He began placing the probe against the engine block systematically, moving from point to point in a pattern that made no immediate sense from the outside, but was in fact a precise sequence derived from diagrams in the brown leather notebook, now open on the workbench beside him. He listened. The bay was silent enough that the only sounds were the faint tick of cooling metal and the occasional distant noise from the street. Audrey held her position for 20 minutes. Then she stood up and walked halfway toward the car. "Have you found something?" Elijah said without looking up. "Not yet, but I know what I'm looking for." She asked what that was, and he straightened slightly and told her, "Rinaldi didn't engineer conventionally, he engineered acoustically. Every component calibrated to resonate at a specific frequency so that the system as a whole operated as a single harmonic unit. If one component is displaced even fractionally from its designed position, the resonance breaks and the whole system shuts down. Not gradually, instantly. There's no error code for it because no diagnostic software was ever written to measure it. You'd have to know it was possible before you could look for it." Audrey was quiet for a moment. "Where did you learn that?" "I spent 3 years studying Rinaldi's work," Elijah said, returning to the stethoscope. "I was going to write a thesis about it." "What happened?" She asked it quietly, the way you ask a question, when you already suspect the answer might be something you don't have the right to hear. Elijah said, "My wife died. After that, I wasn't interested in writing anymore." He said it the same way he said everything, without softness, without hardness, just the plain weight of the fact. Audrey looked at the Miura's engine and said nothing. It was 100 in the morning when he found it. He had removed the 4th layer of the fuel delivery assembly, working with the patience of someone who understands that urgency and speed are not the same thing. And there, tucked between the primary and secondary fuel rails, was a wafer-thin thermal isolation plate that had no business being there according to any factory specification. Rinaldi had fabricated it himself from a titanium copper alloy approximately 2 millimeters in thickness, positioned with tolerances measured in tenths of a millimeter. One of the previous technicians, almost certainly while attempting to investigate the fuel delivery system, had displaced it by 3/10 of a millimeter, enough to break the resonance enough to kill the engine as completely as a power cut. Elijah straightened up and looked at the plate in the light. "The problem is here," he said. "This piece needs to be refabricated and repositioned. The original has been microfractured probably when it was moved, and it won't hold." Audrey said, "It's 100 in the morning." "I know. I need 40 grams of titanium copper alloy and a handheld grinder with a fine grade wheel." She looked at him for a second. Then she picked up her phone. It took her 40 minutes, 3 phone calls, and a $200 surcharge to a 24-hour metal fabrication shop across town, but she got it. Elijah worked for 2 more hours. He fabricated the replacement plate on the workbench using the grinder, the original, as a template, and calipers that measured in hundredths of a millimeter. He checked the thickness at 11 points. He checked it again. Then he reseated the assembly layer by layer. Each component returned to its exact position in the sequence he had documented before disassembly. His hands did not rush. His hands never rushed. They moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had performed 10,000 versions of this motion and no longer needed to think about any of them. Audrey watched without speaking. At some point, Rebecca had quietly brought 2 coffees from a machine somewhere in the building and left one on the bench near Elijah and one near Audrey, and retreated without comment. At 3:45 in the morning, Elijah closed the engine cover, set down his tools, and looked at the Miura. "Start it," he said. Audrey climbed into the driver's seat. She put the key in the ignition. She turned it. The V12 engine turned over, caught and opened into a sound that filled the service bay completely. Not the stuttering, uncertain sound of a sick engine trying, but a deep, even, authoritative bellow that settled immediately into a low, resonant idle. It was the sound of something that knew exactly what it was. Audrey sat in the driver's seat with both hands on the wheel and did not move for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes. When she opened them, Elijah was wiping down his tools and placing them one by one back in the bag. He was at the door with his bag over his shoulder before Audrey got out of the car. "I'll send an invoice by email," he said. "My rates are standard. The parts cost is on top." "I want to know what to pay you," she said. "You'll get what I send." He looked at Micah asleep on the stool. He had brought the boy in after midnight, and Lorraine had carried him inside and settled him there without being asked. And then he picked Micah up, settled the boy against his shoulder, and picked up the red toolbox in the same hand. Micah stirred but did not wake. Elijah walked to his truck in the pre-dawn dark, buckled Micah into the back seat, and drove home. He got there at 6:15. He drank a coffee at the kitchen table in the quiet house while the street outside slowly filled with the sounds of a neighborhood waking up. He was still there when Micah came downstairs at 6:45, blinking and confused, still in the clothes he'd gone to sleep in. "Dad, where did we go?" "I fixed a car," Elijah said. "A nice one." Micah said, not as a question, more as a statement of what he expected from his father's nights. "Yes," Elijah said. "I think you'd like it." There is something worth noticing gently before we move on. A person can spend years preparing for a moment they don't know is coming. They can study, build, refine, and then walk away from all of it believing the preparation has lost its purpose. And then on a Thursday, they could not have planned the preparation will be exactly what someone else needs. Nothing studied carefully is ever truly wasted. It only waits. Rebecca put a tablet in front of Audrey at 7:30 that morning before Audrey had finished her first coffee. On the screen was an article from a German automotive engineering journal dated 2019. The headline read, "Bauer Motorsport appoints Elijah Booker as chief engine architect, youngest in company history." The photograph showed Elijah in a suit, standing beside an engine prototype facing a bank of cameras with the expression of a man who would rather be working on the engine than standing next to it for a photograph. Below the article, Rebecca had pulled up a citation from an academic paper on pre-emissions European powertrains, a paper from 2020 that referenced in a footnote an unpublished research thesis by Elijah Booker of Bauer Motorsport Research Division described as the most thorough existing analysis of Rinaldi's engineering methodology, Rebecca said quietly. He didn't just know about Rinaldi. He is the foremost living authority on Rinaldi's work. Audrey set down her coffee cup. She looked at the photograph for a long time. The younger face, the same flat, steady eyes, the hands that even in a posed photograph looked like they were resting and not performing. She thought about the man in the work jacket at the parts counter on Monday morning, the boy with the red plastic toolbox, the way Elijah had looked at Derek Sullivan for exactly 2 seconds and said nothing and walked out. She thought about all the things that look had contained and all the things he had not bothered to say because he hadn't needed to. She picked up her coffee again. "Where is Derek?" she asked. Rebecca told her. "Send him in," Audrey said. The exhibition that Friday evening was everything it was meant to be. Whitmore Motors' main floor was remade into something between a gallery and a concert hall. Warm light, careful spacing between cars, a string quartet in the corner playing something European and unhurried. The guests came in their good clothes and moved slowly between the vehicles with the particular reverence that expensive, beautiful things tend to produce in people who can afford them. At the center of the display on the raised platform in the middle of the room, the 1971 Lamborghini Miura S sat in its deep orange paint under a light that had been angled specifically to catch the curves of the hood. Its engine was running. The sound it produced was barely audible in the room, a low, settled vibration that you felt more in your chest than heard with your ears. But it was there. And it was perfect. And every person in the room who knew anything about these cars knew what it meant that it was there. Edward Sinclair arrived at 7:15, 20 minutes past the start time, the way men of his particular standing arrive at events unhurried, aware that the room will wait. He was 72, white-haired, and had the bearing of someone who had spent 60 years surrounded by things of exceptional quality and had developed the ability to recognize them without effort. He walked straight to the Miura and put his hand on the hood above the engine and felt the vibration, and stood there for a moment with an expression that was not public. Then he found Audrey. "You did it," he said. Not an accusation, not excessive praise, simply a statement from a man who had not entirely believed it would be done. "I had help," Audrey said. Edward looked at her carefully. He had done business with Audrey for 3 years, and he had never heard her use that particular word in relation to herself. "Who?" Audrey said, "Elijah Booker." Edward Sinclair was quiet for the span of 3 seconds. Then he said slowly, "The Booker who wrote the Rinaldi thesis?" "Yes." "Good God." He looked at the Miura and then back at her. "I read that thesis before it was even finished. A colleague at Bauer sent me 40 pages of it as a draft. I thought whoever wrote it must have spent half a lifetime on it." He paused. "What is he doing now?" "He has a small shop," Audrey said, "on the east side. He does general repair work." Edward looked at her with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but somewhere between the two, aimed at life itself and the strange arrangements it produced. "Some men choose the life they choose," he said. "That's worth respecting." He moved away to rejoin the other guests. Audrey watched him go, and then she looked at the Miura, and then she looked at the space above the street through the tall windows. She stayed there for longer than the evening required. Derek Sullivan had been reassigned on Friday morning, not dismissed. Audrey was not careless about employment. And what Derek Sullivan had done at the parts counter on Monday was not a terminable offense in any legal sense, but he had publicly belittled a customer on her premises, and that customer had turned out to be the only person in the relevant professional world capable of fixing the problem Derek himself had declared unfixable. The reassignment was to a standard technician role 2 levels below his previous position. There was no performance review, no disciplinary letter. Audrey simply told him in the same tone she used to discuss quarterly inventory projections what his new role was and when it would begin. Derek had stood in her office with his jaw set and had not argued because there was nothing to argue. He knew what he had done and he knew what it had cost, and the calculation required no explanation from either party. Elijah's invoice arrived on Saturday morning as promised. The number was reasonable in the way that the invoices of people who are very good at things and have stopped needing to charge what they're worth tend to be reasonable. Audrey looked at it for a moment and then did the math. And then she opened her banking application and transferred 3 times the invoiced amount into the account listed. She did not include a note. She assumed he would understand. He did. He saw the notification while he was halfway through pulling the engine on a 1990-something sedan that had come in that morning. And he looked at the number on the screen, and he felt something that was not surprise. He had expected something like this from Audrey Whitmore, whom he had assessed correctly in the first 20 minutes, and then he put the phone in his pocket and went back to the engine. 3 days later, a white envelope arrived at the shop by regular mail. Inside was a business card, plain heavy stock, the name Edward Sinclair in small capital letters with a phone number and nothing else. On the back, handwritten, "When you're ready to talk not about cars, but about what you still want to do, call me." Elijah held the card for a moment. Then he put it on the shelf beside the brown leather notebook. On Sunday afternoon, Elijah took Micah to the park 2 blocks from their house. It was the kind of afternoon that exists specifically to make cities feel habitable. The temperature exactly right, the light coming through the trees at a useful angle, the benches occupied by the kinds of people who have nowhere more important to be. Elijah sat on the bench nearest the oak trees with a thermos of coffee. Micah ran in wide circles with his red toolbox, performing some elaborate private operation that involved inspecting the bases of trees for structural faults. Elijah watched him and drank his coffee, and was thinking about nothing in particular when he heard footsteps on the path and looked up. Audrey Whitmore was walking toward the bench from the direction of the main gate. She was wearing something that wasn't work clothes, which made her look like a slightly different version of herself. Same posture, same economy of movement, but without the professional architecture. She had recognized him before he recognized her. She stopped about 6 feet away, and they looked at each other. Neither of them said anything for a moment, which under other circumstances might have been awkward, and under these circumstances simply was what it was. Micah came pelting back from the tree line, skidded to a stop, looked at Audrey, and looked at his father. "Do you know her?" he asked. "Yes," Elijah said. Micah looked at Audrey. "Does he know you because of cars?" Audrey glanced at Elijah. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "He helped me fix one," she said. Micah considered this. "Was it a good one?" "Very good," she said. Micah nodded, satisfied with this answer as a complete account of the matter, and ran back to the trees. Elijah moved along the bench slightly. Not an invitation, not its opposite, just space. Audrey sat down. They were quiet for a moment, watching Micah conduct his inspection at the base of a particularly large oak. Audrey said, "You received the transfer." "Yes," Elijah said. "You didn't object." "I don't do charity." She looked at him. "No," she said. "You don't." She looked forward again. The park made comfortable sounds around them. Children, birds, the distant noise of the city containing itself in the afternoon. "Are you going to call Edward?" Audrey asked. Elijah turned his coffee thermos in his hands. "I don't know. Micah's still young." "That's not really an answer."
It just took you away.
"It's the true one." He said it without deflection, without apology. She looked at him for a moment, and then looked back at the field where Micah was now sitting cross-legged on the grass with his toolbox open, arranging the contents in a row in front of him with the seriousness of someone conducting inventory. Audrey said, "What you did Thursday night, not just the technical part, the whole thing. Most people in your position would have let Whitmore Motors fail." "Most people in my position weren't there," Elijah said. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since she had sat down. He looked back. "If there's ever a day when you want to do something more than repair ordinary cars," she said, "I would like to be the first person you call." Elijah held her gaze. "Why?" She paused for a moment, not because she didn't have the answer, but because she was deciding how much of it was appropriate to give. "Because I know what I did on Monday," she said, "and I don't like being in debt." She stood, tucked her hands in her jacket pockets, and walked back the way she had come, unhurried, not looking back. Her footsteps steady on the path until the trees came between her and the bench. Elijah watched until she was gone. Then he looked at Micah, who had finished his inventory and was now holding up the toy wrench and examining it against the light with the expression of a craftsman evaluating a tool. Micah said without looking up, "Did she leave already?" "Yes, she seemed okay." Elijah looked at the path where Audrey had walked. The light through the trees made a pattern on the ground that shifted and settled, shifted and settled. "She might be," he said. Micah accepted this with his characteristic efficiency, put the wrench back in the toolbox and snapped the yellow latch closed. He brought the box over and set it on the bench between them. Red plastic worn at the corners, the paint on the latch scratched from 4 years of use. He climbed up beside it and leaned against his father's arm. Elijah put his arm around the boy. They sat there while the afternoon did its slow, unhurried work around them, and the red toolbox sat between the man and the space he had made on the bench, small and present and still. Some lives are measured by the rooms they get invited into, and the names that get spoken at the top of an article, and the certificates folded carefully in a drawer. Other lives are measured by the weight of a 6-year-old boy leaning against a father's arm on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Both kinds of measure are real. Both ask something of the people who choose them. But only one of them in the end will be returned to you exactly when you need it most. The boy will remember a father who could fix things no one else could fix. He will also remember a father who never raised his voice when he had every right to, and who never explained himself when he didn't need to, and who came home every night and who was there in the morning. That is an inheritance no certificate in any drawer can equal. And it is given quietly day after ordinary day by men whose names the world does not know and may never learn, and who do not need it to.